Okay, so the last video left off with the French and Indian War and the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 was a direct result of the French and Indian War. It said that no colonists could settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. This infuriated the colonists because they felt like they earned the right to settle there because they had fought the war, they had won for war, and they had died for the right to live there. But it was issued because the British said, look, we can't control all that land. You know, we need to settle some sort of, or make some sort of law that says nobody can live there because we're having to fight off Native Americans and it's just too difficult, we're too far away to control that land. Thus, the Proclamation of 1763. And this obviously made the colonists very mad, but it kind of united them all the same against Britain. So not only did they issue the Proclamation of 1763, but the British also issued a series of policies, taxes or acts, whatever you want to call them, one of them being the Sugar Act. It was a part of the Navigation Acts. Now, the Navigation Acts were not all that bad at the beginning until the Sugar Act. This was a tax that was placed on things like molasses, sugar, obviously anything that was sweet. And every colonist, had a little bit of a sugar tooth back then, a little bit of a sweet tooth. And so it really started angering them. They had to pay taxes on all these sugar goods. So the British government used this tax to pay off their own debt. So they were taxing the colonists who lived in America, or the 13 colonies, to pay off their own debt. And the colonists basically said this was unfair because Britain had no right to tax them for something that didn't even relate to them. And they didn't even ask if it was okay about the tax. No tax should be created without the colonies agreeing to it. No taxation without representation. That's where it came from. Another act was the Stamp Act, and this was basically a tax on all goods that came on official paper. Things like diplomas, magazines, newspapers, wills, anything that was on paper had to have an official stamp on it, indicating that it had been paid for it by a tax. So they used this once again to raise money to pay off their debt. But what's kind of cool about the Stamp Act, this happens with a couple of different acts. The colonists, led by Benjamin Franklin, basically went to King George III and said, you repeal this act because we're going to boycott all the goods directly related to Britain and this act. And it worked. It scared the British into saying, hey, you know what, we need these goods, we need this money. So they ended up repealing the Stamp Act thanks to a united front by the colonists led by Benjamin Franklin. The other one, or two more on this board, the Quartering Act. This is the one that a lot of you said in class was one of the most unfair. It's the one that required colonists to feed and house the Britain soldiers. King George basically said, look, I'm going to leave about 10,000 soldiers in the colonies to kind of control things for me, but while they're there, they need a place to stay and you've got to feed them. And of course, that's super unfair. Nobody wants some strange man living in their house. So they had a big issue with that. The Tea Act, which is very controversial and resulted in one of kind of the biggest uproars in American history, known as the Boston Tea Party. But most of the Townshend Acts, which were the first initial series of tax placed on tea and other goods like that, had been repealed. They were gone. But the colonists were still protesting the British by smuggling in tea from Holland and drinking that. So that even though the tax was gone and that act was gone, the Townshend Acts, they still weren't drinking British tea. And Britain, the government, realized, hey, we need the colonists to buy our tea, so they put in the Tea Act. And this helped the British tea merchants be able to gain rights to only one company allowing tea to be traded into the colonies. That was the East India Trading Company, which was owned by Great Britain. So only one company, we call that a monopoly, only one company could sell tea into the 13 colonies. And it really bothered the colonists so much because tea is a very popular drink. It's coffee and tea is still very popular today, but people drank tea like crazy back then. And the result of this was the Boston Tea Party, which was a series of people pushing tea off of Boston Harbor into the Sound out there into the water, and it was a huge demonstration of how they disagreed with the Tea Act. The last acts, and one of the most controversial and one said to have really sparked the idea of revolution, were the Intolerable Acts. The British government called them the Coercive Acts. The colonists said that they were so bad they called them the Intolerable Acts. And they were basically a way for Britain to clamp down on what was happening in Massachusetts. There had been so much resistance with the Boston Tea Party and all this stuff, and even the Boston Massacre, which we'll talk about in class. All this stuff had just kind of boiled over in Massachusetts, and the Intolerable Acts were a way for the British government to clamp down on what was happening. So, and these took away direct liberties, direct freedoms the colonists enjoyed every day. And so it really stung them to their core. And as a result, the colonists were so mad all across, up and down the eastern coast, the 13 colonies, that they agreed to offer help to Massachusetts They provided them with food, they provided them with supplies to make sure they could continue to protest and kind of show Britain how much they hated these intolerable acts. And it really brought them together so much that they had the first Continental Congress. They met in Philadelphia, and they didn't declare their freedom yet, but the first Continental Congress, Philadelphia, decided to boycott all trade with Britain. All trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. That was a huge united front, a huge united movement, and it revolutionized the way that our history happened to turn out because the 13 colonies came together to fight a common enemy. And that, my friends, are the Acts.